All right, I am going to kick things off. There are still a few people joining us, but again, I wanted to welcome everyone. My name is Lauren Glickman. I am a managing partner at Renewcom, and I'm going to be moderating today's discussion on fleet transition. We have two amazing experts with huge depth in this space that is growing and evolving and changing every day. We have Savannah Gupton, managing consultant with CTE, and Brent Johnson, the principal and co-founder of Sage Energy Consulting. So kicking things off today to go over some lessons learned and where this is going, I will turn things over to Savannah Gupton, managing consultant at CTE.
Thanks, Daryl. Hi, everyone. My name is Savannah Gupton. I am a managing consultant with the Center for Transportation and the Environment, also known as CTE. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We function as a engineering and planning firm, mostly a lot of engineers on staff, as well as a lot of folks with policy and communications and other STEM backgrounds on staff. We're a mission-driven nonprofit, so we're beholden to cleaning up our air through the commercialization of clean and efficient transportation technologies. We handle a portfolio of $571 million of research, demonstration, and deployment projects in the zero-emission space, and we do focus solely on zero-emission technologies, so battery electric vehicles as well as fuel cell electric vehicles. We're located all over the United States. We have a presence in both coast, bi-coastal, and right in the middle to make sure we're covering everybody that needs our help. So Atlanta is where we're headquartered. I'm located in Berkeley. We have a Los Angeles contingency as well as a St. Paul group. Next slide. So CTE is really expert at the ZEB transition planning due to our 28 years of experience in smart deployment of zero-emission technologies. So we've had a long time to kind of figure out how the technology has evolved and how to get it on the road in a way that makes people want to commit to it, as well as really having the success of being able to run the duty cycles required of the vehicle to make sure that we're just keeping these vehicles on the road and reducing emissions subsequently. All of that work has really supported our ability to understand, well, okay, we've done this with 5, how do we do it with all 100 of our vehicles? And that's really where this fleet transition planning comes in, is once you've kind of dipped your toes in the water with a zero emission vehicle deployment, what does it look like when you want to go full fleet this way? And we also do this planning for folks who've never deployed, but that's really the foundation of considering a holistic way forward. Next slide. So I think these are my next 2 slides are my favorite slides. This is a 2017 map of our formal transition planning project. So not a lot going on about 3, almost 4 years ago. And then the next slide, we see an explosion of interest. So quite a few more dots on the slide. We've even got 3 going on in Hawaii, all the way to New England. So a lot going on, a lot more interest in these full fleet conversions. And you'll notice a lot of concentration in California, and that's related to the regulation. So these transit agencies, the large ones, are actually required to submit a plan for conversion to zero emission by 2040. And then the smaller agencies are required to submit a plan in 2023. So this is transit specific, but we do expect other markets to follow suit. So I think the general takeaway from here is that it's not just regulation that's driving it, it's general interest in moving forward in this direction for the health of the planet and to reduce our contributions to global emissions. So this slide is really exciting and demonstrable of just kind of the scope and reach and interest of transition planning. Next slide. So CT's specialization comes from our transition methodology. And so we really do a painstakingly detailed process in going through how do we accomplish this full service, moving our full fleets over to zero emission technology. And that starts with the planning and initiation phase, in which we discuss what are the current procurements and plans for the fleet owner. We also move into a GPS data collection and requirements analysis phase, where we really understand what is the energy demand on the vehicle and how do we maintain that level of service there in the service assessment. A fleet assessment, I'll have in my next slide an example of this, but it's how does the composition of the fleet change over time? You know, you can't just retire new vehicles, even if they're internal combustion engine vehicles and you want a zero emission vehicle. We do it on the life cycle basis of the vehicle so that we don't retire vehicles early and waste kind of money and funds and procurements that are already planned before someone's set up to have a zero emission vehicle. Your fuels change with a zero emission vehicle. You either have electricity or you have hydrogen, and that can have a different cost, especially over time. Maintenance, this is kind of the gold medal for zero emission vehicles. We always hope or expect this to go down with that electric drivetrain. And then of course, with a new fuel, there has to be a new way to get the fuel. And we know chargers can sometimes take a little more space in a depot, as well as a hydrogen station. So how do we accomplish fueling these vehicles with the new technology? We wrap all of that into a total cost of ownership analysis and assessment, because really it's great to want to do it, but you have to afford it. And I think a lot of you that resonates with who are attending this webinar. But there is a big cost associated with this, and how does that look and how do we accomplish that and let stakeholders know or legislators know what's needed to fund these efforts. All of those things get wrapped into a zero emission transition plan. This is really the staple concept here. Is it's a full methods document on what assumptions we make about this transition and why we make them and where the real world data comes from that lets us understand that. We model also multiple technology options. It's really important to understand that it's a two technology solution, the transitioning. And so we model that against the baseline. So that's if you're not purchasing any ZEBs or maybe you are purchasing them, but or zero emission vehicles. But just kind of what is your business as usual case? And then we apply all these alternative zero emission technology options to it. So battery electric fleet, whereas you don't have to worry about an on-route charger, then we do incorporate on-route charging planning because sometimes that's really needed to get the vehicle out and back doing what it's supposed to do, as well as a battery electric and fuel cell electric vehicle concept. So you're mixing technologies here. And then we also offer insight into what is a full fuel cell electric bus fleet transition take as well. Next slide. This is a kind of a microscopic view into some of that planning work that we do. First and foremost, the best thing or the most important thing to do with a zero emission vehicle is to make sure it can do what you want it to do. And so CT really spends a lot of time on this with a feasibility assessment and understanding what are the actual blocks required of the fleet owner and how do we make this vehicle work for them. That is the key to successful deployment. And then over time, we apply that feasibility to the composition of the fleet. And you can see that graphic over on the right side. Next slide. All right. So all of that work that happens kind of behind the scenes for our transition plans goes into these two major documents. And if you're in California, you're probably familiar with the Innovative Clean Transit Rollout Plan. That is a legislative requirement document. So I mentioned before, transit agencies have to send in a compliance information about how they're complying with a zero emission transition. So CT can support the response to that legislation, but ultimately that comes from the entity that is submitting it. But the master plans and the ICT rollout plan include all of these items that are listed out. And it's really important to think about these details because they all have a lot of impact on the success of a transition. So are your site plans proper? You know, is it feasible to put a station here? Is it feasible to do charging stations? What's the environmental justice impact of this? How many disadvantaged communities are we serving? What's the purchasing schedule? I know a lot of folks need to know that in order to even just get things off the ground with their board and get a plan going. Fleet compositions, like on the last slide, are demonstrated. And then, of course, the total cost of ownership, really interesting for the legislator and for folks who have to pay for this. Next slide. So lastly, I think the big thing to take home here is that a full fleet transition requires that you think about the entire ecosystem. and how to accomplish this in a way that is really thoughtful and therefore successful, and what goes into it. Your energy supply also matters. And so that's why partnering with SAGE is really special to us. And Brent is going to go into that a little bit more after me, but this is just a list of the projects we are working on. And you can see that it's school districts, it's transit agencies who are really thinking about the full capacity of deploying, and then deploying with the thoughtfulness of future planning. So that's all I have. Next slide. I'll pass it to Brent.
Thanks, Savannah. So as mentioned before, Brent Johnson, one of the co-founders of SAGE. SAGE is located in San Rafael, California, so San Francisco Bay Area. And I lead up our EV fleet projects, including on-site DER, distributed energy resources such as solar batteries and microgrids. Next slide, please. So SAGE is an independent energy planning and project management firm. We've got 10 plus current EV fleet projects, not just transit and schools, but also some private entities looking at least dipping their toe in with EVs, if not doing full-fledged transitions. And we serve as owner's rep, meaning we sit on your side of the table, bring the expertise for pretty much any sort of advanced energy or EV project aspect you can think of, including third-party finance, assisting with energy contract negotiations, as I mentioned, solar batteries, microgrids, etc. Next slide, please. So this is a pretty brief talk, and trying to squeeze a lot in, but this is really focused in on implementing electric vehicle supply infrastructure or equipment. That's the EVSE acronym that you see up above there. And this is kind of a simplified approach to making it happen. There's obviously, we could talk for hours on the complexities of this, but the turquoise box fleet and funding plan is what Savannah just talked about, and then I'm going to talk about this process here in front of you for implementing your supply infrastructure. So schedule, make sure you have the chargers when your vehicles arrive. Very important, and there's definitely stories of that not being the case. Utility, this is your new fuel supplier, and you need to engage early, and they have an interest in working with you. You represent a major new growth in load and energy sales for them. Selecting the chargers, also critical, and a number of considerations around those chargers, including the charge management platform. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Operational planning. With electricity as your new fuel, it operates pretty differently from a diesel or a natural gas fuel. While it is a commodity, it has very different pricing structures that you have to consider. And then you also have options around on-site generation, storage, etc. Implementation. Generally, this can be fairly efficient if you have a small fleet or you're doing just, say, simple level 2 chargers, but it can get a lot more complex as you get into large fleets and DC fast charging, or you start thinking about something besides a simple plug like pantographs or inductive charging. And then number 6, monitoring and optimizing is obviously critical. This is you're implementing a brand new technology into your fleet, and monitoring how it's doing, breaking it in, training your drivers, all of that is critical. Next slide, please. So a lot of my talk, I'm just going to kind of talk through examples because I think they really help illustrate some of the details and just what some of our clients have gone through. So one example we're working with right now with CT is Redwood City School District, which is up in the Bay Area, Northern California. Utility is Pacific Gas and Electric. And they received grant funding for 6 Bluebird micro buses. That's that bus shown on the left there, and one big Type D 84 passenger bus. The incentives that came through for them are some state incentives through the CEC Prop 39 program. Utility has a number of incentives that are available to them. And they're, of course, applying for others because all of these grants, or most of the grants, at least in California, are stackable. So always good to keep looking. And the utility pays, in this case, the utility will pay for the upgrades to their service for the site to support the electric vehicle build out, but it's a 5-year planning horizon. So the utility requires the client to decide on what their rollout looks like. So this district, by board decision had to say, okay, this is what we're going to commit to for the next 5 years, and they've committed to 12 buses. So that means the utility is going to fund all the upgrades that are needed for those 12 buses on their side of the meter. And I'll dig into that a little bit in the following slides. Next slide, please. So just a real simple schedule here. Let's say that the milestone up above is that we've got a fleet plan together and we start engaging with the utility and planning with the utility. So that engagement, getting to know each other and kind of setting the plan is going to be at least a 3-month process. In a lot of cases, that can stretch on quite a bit more, depending on the decision process on your side of the table. So how quickly can you reach a decision as to what your fleet looks like, and then obviously the utility's responsiveness and how far along they are with implementing these sort of programs. Design and construction, showing 10 months there. We're experiencing a lengthening of that line on this project, and I think we can blame it on a number of other factors going on in the world at the moment. But I think the take home here is working with the utility, it's at least a 12-month process, and this is for 12 level 2 chargers. This is not for 100 chargers or 200 chargers. So this really can be the tail that wags the dog. So talk to your utility early and get a dialogue going and work with them right out the gate. And then on the owner side of the table, you've got to select your charging equipment, you've got to do that operational planning, and then follow your typical design, procure, and construction process. In a lot of cases, you can do design build on these, especially on simpler projects. And those orange bars will lengthen if you start adding in more complexity. So if you add in solar, if you add in storage, or if you add in unique charging like pantographs or inductive charging. Next slide, please. So on the utility engagement side, I'm going to keep going with the PG&E example here. And by the way, PG&E is kind of one of the lead utilities, I'd say, in the country on programs like this, and they have some great documentation on their website. So with PG&E, the green section of that diagram is what they will pay for. So any upgrades on their side of the meter, including grid upgrades, et cetera. And then the blue is what's going on the site, and that is what the customer needs to pay for, and PG&E needs to actually take over the design and work on, and PG&E will give some money to that customer for those site upgrades. Other utilities like SCE will actually take on that work in the blue box, and the customer only has to pay for the charger and implement the charger. So very utility specific, and of course utilities are a lot of utilities are just developing these programs and launching them. Tariffs, very important with utilities as well. Next slide. So selecting your equipment, number of considerations when you're selecting your equipment. You likely have defined some of this up front in your fleet plan, but you obviously have to be able to plug into the vehicle and charge either on the AC or DC side, depending what the vehicle can handle. The fleet requirements, whether you need to do quick turnarounds or you can do slow overnight charging. Funding requirements have a lot to do with what chargers you can select. A lot of funding sources have lists that you have to choose from. So it's pretty important to look at those quickly. And then charge management platform compatibility. So the software that you want to use to help manage your charging needs to work with the charger. And some of the chargers have proprietary platforms, and they're not all interoperable. So next slide. So key considerations, I kind of just ran through that. I think I'll hit on the other one again though, is if you're not using a standard plug-in level 2, level 3 type charger, and you're thinking of something more elaborate like the pantograph, which is the overhead, or the inductive, which is typically buried in the pavement underneath and does not use wires. Plan for a longer design cycle, a longer schedule, and there's fewer choices and fewer precedents out there around those. And then quick example of that cross-reference list based on funding in Northern California is in that table below. Next slide. Operational planning. Touched on this earlier, but the amount of electricity is going to be determined by what your vehicles are, what the routes are, how efficient they are. Electricity cost is highly variable depending on what utility you're working with and whether they have tariffs for charging. And also it has a time dependency to it, which is really not something you're probably used to dealing with a hydrocarbon-based fuel. And then how do you mitigate that cost with electricity as a new fuel? Charge management, that software is critical. On-site DER, and then there are incentives depending on your market. And a really key one in California is the Low Carbon Fuel Standard Credit, LCFS. It's very generous and has a lot to do with making the financial aspects of these projects work. Next slide. Just final kind of take-homes on actually implementing these projects. Plan on an 18-month process with your utility, unless you're really dead simple or you don't need upgrades on your site. It's going to take a while. You might get lucky and have a really responsive utility, but it's going to take a while. A number of the funding sources out there will pay for this, that paid for your vehicles also have funding that pays for the infrastructure. So look around for that. In a lot of cases in California, we're getting most or all of that infrastructure cost paid for through funding sources. And plan for 1+ years of break-in or more. And you have to monitor, train, test, optimize. It doesn't stop as soon as you put in this equipment. There's going to be hiccups, and you need to be on top of it. I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you both for really interesting overviews. And I just want to remind everyone that they can submit questions that they have. A few have already come in via the Q&A feature. We've had quite a few questions come in, so I want to let people know if we don't get to your question today, we will follow up with you with an answer afterwards. And so the first question that I have is for Savannah. So, you kicked off your presentation with those two maps. So what do you think has been driving the uptick in fleet electrification in recent years? And how do you see the new Biden administration influencing the next 4 years?
Great question. Thanks. So I think the big one, the most obvious low-hanging fruit here is that California regulation is driving all those dots in the left side. And so part of that is also like LCFS engagement, so low carbon fuel standard credits, which can help this be more affordable. In addition to VW mitigation funds, which is not just California, that spurred a lot of ESB investment as well. And I think generally folks are just kind of seeing the future with zero emissions. You know, vehicles, they're quieter, they're cleaner, everyone wants cleaner air. So that interest is also there, as well as kind of the environmental appeal of zero emission and that kind of marketing appeal as well. And so I think with the Biden administration, there is going to be a lot more opportunity, I think, to explore this greener regulation. We're hopeful about that, and definitely see it, more dots on the map in the future for sure.
And Savannah, I think just tearing off what you said, sustainability missions, I think we're seeing really drive this, you know, outside of regulatory requirements like the clean transportation rules in California. You know, we're seeing corporate entities implementing EVs just as part of their corporate sustainability missions.
And so we've actually had a few questions come in surrounding a similar topic. So for all of you who did ask this question, I'm sort of going to conflate all of your questions into one. And Savannah or Brent, either of you can answer this, but there have been a few questions around power outages and how resilient is is your fleet once it's been electrified. So could either of you speak to resiliency and fleet electrification?
I'm happy to take that. It's probably a 2-day discussion, but it's definitely a concern, right? I mean, you have a hydrocarbon-based fuel, you usually have it stored on site, and your resiliency is, you know, power supply to make sure your pumping or compression infrastructure works. In this case, electricity is your new fuel, and the grid goes down, and you don't have that fuel. So near-term resiliency strategies, we're seeing a lot of entities considering their, you know, diesel and natural gas vehicles that are remaining as their resiliency strategy. But long-term, as there's full fleet conversions, it is either going to be, well, it's essentially if those vehicles need to be used in an emergency, and typically they don't all need to be used or during a grid outage, you build basically a microgrid for the site. So that can be in the form of solar and stationary storage. And if you have really high power needs, then you're looking at on-site generation as well. So diesel or battery gensets, or sorry, diesel or natural gas gensets, or down the line, probably hydrogen-based electricity generation.
So that actually ties really well into the next question that I have, which is so, you know, you mentioned that adding solar and storage to a project, you know, increases the timeline. How feasible is it generally to look at on-site generation options like solar carports or standalone storage for your fleet electrification planning?
So a couple of kind of key constraints or considerations would be footprint, and then cost, right? So at Sage, when we're looking at one of these projects, we're very sensitive to cost and making sure that these projects make financial sense for our clients, and that's very market dependent, right? So it very much has to do with the cost of your electricity and any sort of ancillary benefit you're going to get out of putting those assets on your site. For instance, in California, with the low carbon fuel standard credit, you actually have an enhanced credit if you're fueling with solar. And that solar doesn't necessarily have to be on site. You can go out and buy RECs, but there is some financial driver on top of just offsetting the cost of utility electricity. So financially, we do see it make sense in the right markets. But it's, you know, with these new EV tariffs, the price of electricity is generally lower, and the economics are a little trickier. And then footprint, solar you can usually implement relatively easily because you can do canopies and get up above the parking areas. Batteries, a little trickier. They take up a fair bit of space.
And then, Savannah, I think this question is probably good for you. So for a business that's in the early stages of thinking about making the transition to electric vehicles, where would you suggest that they start? What would be the best first step?
Yeah, best first step is to call CTE. So having a consultant or someone representing the interest of the technology's success and the interest of the fleet owner is really important. These vehicles are unique in their operations. It's not often one for one, or it can be quite different for the staff that operates the vehicles. And so having somebody who's really seasoned support your staff or support anyone working on this initiative is super imperative to success. And that's really what our mission is. And so definitely that. I think the other big one is that's mentioned before is talking to the utility, getting them engaged early. Like Brent said, it can be a long game with them. So getting them involved, they usually want to help, especially because it kind of benefits their bottom line if you're charging with their supply. So that too, and because they often have programs in place for that in some states. And then building partnerships as well, like with a consultant, with the utility, and other folks that could support the transition. That's really the first place to look, is who can help you.
So building off of that, I mean, how receptive really are utilities to these conversations around the EV transition? Are there any sort of tips that for successfully engaging with the utility early on, since that seems to be such an important step?
Yeah, I think,
Yeah, either one.
Brent, do you want to take this one? Or
You can start, Savannah. I'll add on.
We'll start by saying I think that there's a lot of variability in people's experience engaging their utility, but generally, I'm often in PG&E territory. I live in Northern California, and they have programs, and they have a lot of enthusiasm for working with entities that want to move in this direction. I think a really notable one is the situation with ESPs and the utility in Virginia. So a utility is actually supporting the vehicle purchase for a school district. So you can get really, really wonderful stories like that. I think the utilities can often be burdened. So that can take a while, like Brent said, but it's definitely worth doing, and you'll find reception there if you look for it. Brent?
Yeah, I think there's a full spectrum of how much utilities have jumped into this, and I think at the really engaged end are the PG&Es and the other IOUs in California as well, SCE, SDG&E. They've all launched these fleet charging programs now, and are kind of actively engaged with their customers. So I think if you're working with a utility who hasn't gotten excited about this, I think you could point them to some of these utilities, and there's lots of web resources from these other utilities online that kind of show what their programs look like and that they're offering EV specific tariffs, just as examples for your utility. But I think you also just really need to express to your utility representative that you represent a significant new load and a sector of new load. So I think if they're not excited about it, you got to do some cheerleading and gonna show them what others are doing, and that that you represent a significant new customer.
And so what would you guys say are some of the best policies that are supporting and driving fleet electrification. So, obviously is there are things that California is doing that you think are good examples for other states to follow, or other states that you could list as examples?
I can start. So I think the big wow, I just really blanked out. Will you say that again really quick for me, Lauren?
Sure. What are the best policies, that you've seen for supporting fleet electrification? I would say both at the state and local level, whether that's in California or beyond.
Okay, yeah, definitely. So I started thinking, listing them all in my head, but I think the best policies are the ones that come with financial support. So an unfunded mandate is a little difficult to swallow for especially school districts that have to pay out of pocket for this, and transit agencies that are already quite strained. So having that, we know that the capital cost of the vehicle is quite a bit higher. Fuel cell and battery vehicles are more expensive than a traditional one. So any legislation or any program that use cap and trade dollars, or like VW mitigation is a great example. We have funding support. HVIP from CARB is another great example where there's funds to support to incentivize the transition. So we always want to lobby for those, as well as with that's kind of the point of the TCO with our transition modeling is we all want to do it, but we have to be really realistic about how much it costs. So any legislation related to that, and I think you could find a list of them in California. I think that other states are going to come to the table as well. I think there's a future for that, as well as federal support. So I won't name any specifically, because I think Brent had some in his slides, but he may want to go into some more specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I think outside of California, I'd say the VW mitigation money, which I think you mentioned as well, Savannah, is some kind of non-state. I mean, the states are responsible for it, but it was part of this big fund that was doled out to all the states. So those are some incentives that are floating around out there outside of California that could help move things along. And another thing that I'd say from the California market that is going to be important in other markets are utility tariffs specifically for EV charging. So a lot of utilities have demand charges, and when you start adding this level of load to a site, existing commercial tariffs can be pretty punitive for this huge new load growth. And the utilities need to get on board and craft tariffs that work for folks with big new charging loads.
So following up on policies and regulation, someone has asked a question about regulations as it relates to, so I guess, mandating zero-emission school buses. Do you guys have a sense of, I mean, obviously no one can predict the future, but when zero-emission buses might be required? So they've heard 2045, 2023. Do you guys have thoughts on where that landscape is going, or if a good reliable place to follow to get that type of information?
That's a crystal ball question.
Yeah, given the people with
um, well, I would have said it's way out there up until we had these ICE vehicle rules announced in the last few months in California, that they're going to cut off sale of internal combustion engine passenger vehicles. I forget the date now. Maybe Savannah, you remember, but schools are tricky because schools are historically underfunded, and again, we're talking about California market at the moment. Historically underfunded, and transportation is particularly underfunded at schools in California. And I think the regulators are wary of heaping another mandate on the schools. So whatever they do, it's going to have to come with serious funding to at least make these zero emission vehicles on par with diesel, and hopefully more affordable, because there is all this planning and kind of infrastructure and other transition cost that comes with it. So I don't know if I want to throw out a date. Savannah, you got a date in mind?
No, I won't do that either, but I'll answer you. So the new SEM regulation is 2035 phasing out diesel.
Right, and then transit vehicles, it's 2030, is it, that they're not allowed to buy any more diesel or hydrogen, or sorry, ICE vehicles?
I
Is that,
want to say
is that the
yes.
correct date? I'm pretty sure it is. So, there's mandates on transit. There's new executive orders around ICE vehicles. I think school buses are coming, but again, there's really got to be funding with it.
So we have a couple more minutes, and so I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 more questions. And for everyone who does have a question in the queue that we haven't gotten to, I want to remind you we will follow up with you. But so one of the questions, relates to the fact that there are thousands of internal combustion engine buses that are already out there. Do you guys see there being an opportunity for conversion of these buses in some way rather than complete replacement?
I can take this. Brent?
No, I think that'd be good, Sven. I think you guys are, CTE is more the vehicle folks. So.
Yeah, definitely. So generally, the answer is yes. There are groups that do retrofitting of ICE vehicles. For CTE, how we've generally operated is that there's a lot of new stuff on these buses. They're smarter, and in addition to the electric drivetrain, and in addition to the fuel cell or the battery, whatever you have, and that we generally feel it's better to just build the new bus with all of the bells and whistles of the electric vehicle. And so it's not something that is totally impossible, but generally for our transition modeling and our deployments, we assume a new electric vehicle, fuel cell or battery electric.
And so with 1 minute remaining, my final question that I'm going to give to both of you is for all of these, attendees that we have on the call, if you could give, if they're going to leave this conversation today with one thing, what one piece of advice do you want to leave our webinar attendees with today? And so, Savannah, I will go to you first.
Sure. Yeah, I think generally I said this early, but if you're looking to transition your fleet, look for help. There's some folks out here that really want to help it go right. We're in a long game against climate change. And so with a short duration to get something done meaningfully. And so we want to do it right with a good, thoughtful roadmap in the first place. And so find some folks to help you out to do that, some experts in EV. And that's really what you need to be really successful here.
Savannah took mine.
Good
but I don't know. We've harped on it, but engage with your utility. A lot of them are getting real smart around this, and they can help you, and they have some good literature. But outside of working with CTE and Sage, engage with your utility as soon as you can.
And that brings us to the end. Those 45 minutes, they went so quickly. I know that I learned a lot from today's conversation. So again, I want to thank our hosts, Sage Energy Consulting and CTE. And for everyone who joined us, and again, for your questions, we will be following up because there are still several in the queue. But we hope everyone enjoys the rest of your Thursday.